The phone rang in the darkness of Linda Leavitt's bedroom at exactly 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March, its shrill tone cutting through the silence like a blade. When she saw her daughter's name flashing on the screen, Karoline read heart. Her heart immediately clenched with the kind of maternal fear that never leaves, no matter how old your children get or how successful they become. On the other end of the line, Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in American history, was sobbing so hard she could barely form words. Her breath came in ragged gasps, punctuated by the kind of raw, primal crying that comes from a soul pushed beyond its breaking point. Between the tears and the hyperventilating, she managed to whisper the words that would shatter both their worlds and change everything forever. "Mom, I think I'm losing myself. I don't know who I am anymore. I can't do this. I'm drowning, and I don't know how to swim back to shore." 3 hours and 17 minutes earlier, Karoline had been standing alone in the pristine marble bathroom of the East Wing, her reflection fractured in the ornate mirror that had witnessed decades of American political history. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, revealing every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every compromise that had slowly chipped away at the idealistic young woman she used to be. At 27, she had achieved what most political operatives only dream of: a direct line to the most powerful office in the world, her name in history books, respect from colleagues twice her age, but the face staring back at her was that of a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt from stress-induced loss of appetite, and carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Her hands trembled as she gripped the marble countertop, her knuckles white with tension. The navy blue blazer that had once made her feel powerful and professional now felt like a costume, a disguise she wore to hide the frightened girl underneath. Her reflection wavered as tears began to blur her vision. "I used to love this," she whispered to the empty room, her voice echoing off the pristine walls. "When did I stop believing in any of it? When did I become someone I don't recognize?" The final straw had come during that evening's press briefing, what would later be called the Tuesday Night Massacre by political commentators. A veteran reporter, someone Karoline had once admired and hoped to earn respect from, had looked her directly in the eyes and asked, "Ms. Leavitt, how can someone who's barely lived outside of campaign bubbles and academic institutions truly understand the struggles of working families? How can you speak for people whose experiences are so far removed from your own privileged background?" The question wasn't unfair. It was actually quite reasonable, but something about the dismissive tone, the way the reporter's eyes had narrowed with what looked like contempt, the subtle smirks from other journalists in the room, had cracked something deep inside her chest. She had felt exposed, fraudulent, like a child playing dress-up in clothes that would never fit properly. She had maintained her composure, delivered the prepared talking points with the practiced smile that had become her trademark, and deflected with the kind of political non-answer that she had learned to deploy like armor. But inside, something fundamental had broken. The idealistic young woman who had once believed that truth and transparency could coexist with political success had finally faced the harsh reality that maybe, just maybe, she had been naive all along. The moment she reached her Georgetown apartment, a sterile, barely lived-in space that felt more like a hotel room than a home, the carefully constructed walls she had built around her emotions came crashing down with devastating force. Linda Leavitt had been dreaming of her daughter's childhood when the phone rang, lost in a vivid memory of 8-year-old Karoline standing on a makeshift stage constructed from their living room coffee table and couch cushions. In the dream, little Karoline was wearing her father's oversized tie and her mother's reading glasses, passionately arguing why vegetables should be mandatory in school lunches, her tiny fists pumped with the kind of righteous determination that only children possess. Her argument had been so compelling that even their golden retriever, Murphy, had seemed to nod in agreement from his spot on the rug. The jarring transition from that warm, innocent memory to the sound of her adult daughter's broken, desperate voice created a pain so sharp and immediate that Linda felt as though someone had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart with ice-cold fingers. "Sweetheart, what's wrong? Are you hurt? Are you safe?" Linda asked, her voice thick with sleep and mounting panic as she fumbled for the bedside lamp. The soft yellow light illuminated her husband Tom's face as he stirred beside her, his eyes immediately alert to the crisis in her voice. After 32 years of marriage, he could read her emotional state like a well-worn book. "I can't do this anymore, Mom. Karoline sobbed, her words tumbling out in a torrent of anguish. Every single day I walk into that briefing room and I lie. Not about facts or policies. I would never do that. But about who I am. I pretend to be strong when I'm falling apart inside. I pretend to have answers when I'm more confused and lost than anyone in that room. I look at those reporters, people I used to respect and admire, and I see them looking at me like I'm just a kid playing dress-up in her mother's clothes, pretending to understand a world that's too big and too complicated for someone like me. Linda's heart shattered as she listened to her daughter's pain, each word landing like a physical blow. This was the same little girl who had once written a 12-page letter to the president at age 10, complete with hand-drawn charts and graphs, asking if she could help solve world hunger and offering to donate her allowance to the cause. The same teenager who had spent her weekends volunteering at homeless shelters, organizing voter registration drives, and tutoring elementary school children in reading. The same young woman who had called her, breathless with excitement and barely able to contain her joy, just 2 years ago when she got the job that was supposed to be the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. "Tell me what happened tonight, baby," Linda said softly, settling into the gentle, soothing voice she had perfected during Karoline's childhood thunderstorm fears and teenage heartbreaks. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." Tom sat up beside her, his hand finding hers in the darkness, offering silent support as they both prepared to help their daughter through what sounded like the crisis of her young life. As Karoline's initial wave of tears began to subside into exhausted hiccups, she found herself pouring out months of suppressed frustration, disillusionment, and fear to the one person who had always believed in her unconditionally. She spoke about the gradual erosion of her idealism, describing how the job she had imagined, being a bridge between the administration and the American people, fostering understanding and transparency, had morphed into something entirely different and far more soul-crushing than she had ever anticipated. "Remember when I was 17 and we had that long talk after I lost the student body president election?" Karoline asked, her voice now hoarse from crying but steadier than it had been when she first called. "You made me that huge mug of hot chocolate with the little marshmallows, and we sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning talking about what it really means to serve others. I told you that night that I wanted to be the voice of truth in government. Someone who could help people understand complex issues without dumbing them down or manipulating them." Linda remembered that conversation with crystal clarity. It had been one of those pivotal mother-daughter moments that she had treasured and replayed in her mind countless times over the years. Karoline had been devastated by her election loss, not because she cared about the title or the power, but because she genuinely believed she could have made a difference in her classmates' lives. "You told me that if anyone could change the system from within, it would be me," Karoline continued, her voice breaking again. "You said I had the intelligence, the integrity, and the compassion to make a real difference. But Mom, I haven't told the complete truth in months. Not because I'm dishonest or corrupt, but because the truth is so incredibly complicated and nuanced. And everyone, the press, the public, even my own colleagues, wants simple, black and white answers to questions that exist in infinite shades of gray." She described the impossible position she found herself in daily, trying to represent an administration whose policies she sometimes disagreed with privately, while facing a press corps that seemed more interested in creating gotcha moments than in genuinely understanding complex issues. She talked about the young staffers who looked up to her, expecting her to have all the answers, and the seasoned political operatives who dismissed her ideas because she lacked their cynicism and battle scars. "I see the way people look at me now," Karoline continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her footing in the conversation. "The reporters who used to treat me as a colleague now look at me like I'm either naive or complicit. My own team members sometimes talk to me like I'm a mascot rather than a professional. Some days I feel like a complete fraud, standing up there pretending to have authority I don't actually possess. Other days I feel like I'm the only honest person in a room full of people who've forgotten what truth even looks like. But either way, I'm failing everyone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of dreams that seemed to be crumbling in real time. Linda could hear her daughter's breathing, still uneven but no longer panicked, and she could picture her sitting in that sterile apartment, probably on the floor with her back against the wall, a position Karoline had always taken when she needed to think clearly. "Most of all," Karoline whispered, her voice barely audible, "I'm failing you and Dad. You raised me to be better than this, to stand for something meaningful. Instead, I've become exactly what I used to criticize. A political operative more concerned with managing perception than with seeking truth. Linda found herself transported back to a crisp October evening when Karoline was 16, sitting at their kitchen table after losing her first serious political campaign, a run for student body president that she had approached with the intensity and dedication of a presidential race. She had been absolutely devastated, convinced that her loss meant she wasn't cut out for public service, that her dreams of making a difference were naive fantasies that had no place in the real world. Linda had found her daughter that night, still in her campaign t-shirt, surrounded by poster boards and unused flyers, crying over what she saw as evidence of her own inadequacy. They had sat together until dawn, sharing stories, fears, and dreams over steaming mugs of hot chocolate topped with marshmallows that slowly dissolved into sweet, creamy swirls. "You know what I told you that night?" Linda asked gently, her voice carrying the warmth of 1,000 bedtime stories and heart-to-heart conversations. "I told you that the hardest part about trying to change the world isn't dealing with the people who oppose you outright. It's holding on to who you are when everything and everyone around you is trying to change you into someone else. I told you that the system would try to break you down and rebuild you in its own image, but that your job was to hold on to your core self no matter what." Karoline was quiet on the other end of the line, and Linda could hear her daughter's breathing slowly returning to its normal rhythm. She could almost see her closing her eyes, the way she always did when she was trying to access deep memories or work through complex emotions. "I remember," Karoline whispered after a long moment. "You said that real leaders aren't the ones who never doubt themselves or never make mistakes. They're the ones who doubt themselves, make mistakes, feel overwhelmed, and keep going anyway because they believe in something bigger than their own comfort or success. And do you remember what else I said? The most important part?" There was another long pause, filled with the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who truly know and love each other. Linda could hear the faint sounds of DC traffic through her daughter's phone, the distant hum of a city that never truly sleeps. "You said that if I ever felt like I was losing myself, if I ever felt like the person I was becoming wasn't the person I wanted to be, I should call you no matter what time it was, no matter how successful or important I had become, and you would help me find my way back to who I really am," Karoline answered, her voice barely audible but steadier than it had been all night. Linda smiled through her own tears, feeling a surge of fierce maternal love and pride. "Well, here we are, sweetheart. It's 2:45 in the morning, you're crying and scared and feeling lost, and I'm still your mom. I'm still the woman who believes in you more than anyone else in this world. So let's figure this out together, just like we always have." Over the next hour and 17 minutes, mother and daughter talked in a way they hadn't in years, not about politics or careers or public perception, but about values and purpose, and the girl Karoline used to be before the world told her who she should become. Linda shared stories about her own moments of profound doubt as a young teacher, times when she had questioned whether she was making any real difference in her students' lives, or just going through the motions of a job that seemed increasingly difficult and thankless. She told Karoline about the night she had called her own mother, crying because she felt like she was failing her students, failing the education system, and failing herself. She described how her mother had reminded her that doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It's actually evidence that you care deeply about doing the right thing. "The thing about integrity," Linda said, settling more comfortably into her bed as she prepared for what she sensed would be a long but important conversation, "is that it's not about being perfect or having all the answers or never making mistakes. Integrity is about being authentic and honest, even when authenticity is messy and complicated and doesn't fit neatly into talking points or sound bites." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You think you're failing everyone because you don't have simple answers to complex questions. But maybe, just maybe, the fact that you recognize the complexity, that you're struggling with these contradictions instead of ignoring them, is exactly what makes you the right person for this job." Karoline found herself thinking about a moment from the previous week when a young reporter, barely older than herself and clearly new to the White House press corps, had asked a question about climate change with such genuine concern and hope in her voice that Karoline had momentarily forgotten her prepared talking points. Instead of delivering the standard administration line, she had answered from her heart, acknowledging the legitimate fears that young people have about their future while explaining the complexities of policy implementation in a divided government. The response had been criticized by her colleagues as off-message and emotionally driven, but it had generated more positive public response than anything she had said in months. More importantly, it had felt true in a way that most of her public statements hadn't in a long time. "What if I'm not strong enough for this job, Mom?" Karoline asked, voicing the fear that had been eating at her for months. "What if I'm too young, too idealistic, too emotionally invested to do what needs to be done?" Linda was quiet for a moment, and Karoline could hear her father's voice in the background, asking if everything was okay. She heard her mother's muffled response, "She's going to be fine. She's stronger than she knows." "Strength isn't about never breaking down, sweetheart," Linda finally replied. "Strength isn't about having thick skin or being able to deflect criticism without feeling it. Strength is about breaking down at 2 a.m. when you feel like you can't take another step, and then getting up the next morning and trying again because you still believe in the work you're doing, even when that work is harder than you ever imagined it could be." She paused, and Karoline could hear the smile in her voice. "You called me tonight because some part of you, maybe a part you're not even fully conscious of yet, still believes in the importance of what you're doing. That part of you, the part that cares so deeply that it's willing to risk everything for the chance to make a difference, that's the part worth fighting for. That's the part that makes you who you are." Linda went on to remind Karoline of all the times she had faced seemingly impossible challenges and found ways to overcome them. The high school debate tournament where she had been given a position she disagreed with and still managed to argue it persuasively while maintaining her personal integrity. The college campaign where she had worked for a candidate she believed in despite knowing they had no chance of winning. The graduate school thesis that had taken her 3 years to complete because she refused to accept easy answers to complex questions. "You've never taken the easy path," Linda said. "Even as a little girl, you always chose the harder right over the easier wrong. That's who you are at your core, and no job, no matter how prestigious or powerful, should ever ask you to betray that fundamental part of yourself." When Karoline woke up 6 hours later, sunlight was streaming through the gauze curtains of her Georgetown apartment, creating dancing patterns on the hardwood floor. She felt different. Not fixed, not suddenly confident or certain about her future, but different in a way that felt like possibility, like the first green shoots of hope, pushing through frozen ground after a long, harsh winter. She looked at herself in the same bathroom mirror that had shown her such despair just hours before, and while she still saw exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes and uncertainty in the set of her shoulders, she also saw something else. A spark of the determination that had carried her through every challenge she had ever faced, the same fire that had burned in the eyes of that 8-year-old girl standing on a coffee table, arguing passionately for what she believed was right. As she prepared for the day, choosing a softer blouse instead of her usual severe blazer, letting her hair fall naturally instead of pulling it back into the tight chignon that had become her armor, she found herself thinking about her mother's words. She thought about the young reporter who had asked about climate change, and about all the other young people watching her, looking for someone who would tell them the truth, even when the truth was complicated and scary. At that morning's press briefing, when a veteran reporter asked her about the administration's position on a controversial immigration policy, Karoline took a deep breath and did something she hadn't done in months. She told the truth, not the political truth or the convenient truth or the strategically advantageous truth, but her truth, filtered through her understanding of the policy's complexities and her genuine concern for all the people it would affect. "That's a deeply complex issue that deserves a thoughtful, nuanced response rather than a soundbite," she began, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "While I can share the administration's official position, I think it's important to acknowledge that reasonable people disagree on this topic. And those disagreements often come from genuine differences in values, experiences, and priorities. Rather than pretending this is simple when it's not, let me walk you through both the policy details and some of the legitimate concerns that have been raised by various stakeholders." The briefing room fell unusually quiet. Some reporters looked surprised, others skeptical, clearly waiting for the catch or the pivot back to standard talking points. But a few, including the young woman who had asked about climate change the week before, nodded with what looked like respect and genuine interest. For the next 23 minutes, Karoline led what would later be described as the most substantive policy discussion the White House briefing room had seen in months. She didn't dodge difficult questions or hide behind bureaucratic language. Instead, she acknowledged uncertainties, admitted when she didn't have complete information, and promised to follow up with detailed answers, rather than offering superficial responses. The political commentators would have mixed reactions. Some would praise her honesty and depth, others would criticize her for showing weakness or for being off-message. But for the first time in months, Karoline felt like herself again, like the person her parents had raised her to be, the person she had always intended to become. Later that evening, as she sat in her apartment eating takeout Chinese food and reviewing the day's news coverage, Karoline called her mother again. This time, she wasn't crying. "How did it go today?" Linda asked, her voice warm with maternal concern and barely contained hope. "It was terrifying," Karoline admitted, twirling lo mein noodles around her chopsticks. "I kept waiting for someone to tell me I had gone too far, that I was going to be fired or reassigned or benched. But Mom, it felt like me again. For the first time in months, I felt like the person you and Dad raised me to be." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know if I can fix everything that's wrong with political communication in this country. I don't know if I'll be able to keep this job if I keep prioritizing honesty over messaging discipline. But for the first time since I started this job, I remembered why I wanted to do this work in the first place. I remembered that little girl who wanted to help solve world hunger, and the teenager who believed that government could be a force for good if the right people were willing to tell the truth, even when it was hard." Linda smiled, thinking of that 8-year-old on the living room stage, the 16-year-old at the kitchen table working through her first real disappointment, and the 27-year-old who had called her crying at 2 a.m. and then found the courage to be herself again. "That's my girl," she said simply, her voice thick with pride and love. "That's my brilliant, brave, beautiful girl." 3 months later, Karoline would make the difficult decision to resign from her position as press secretary, not in defeat or disgrace, but as a conscious choice to prioritize her integrity over her career advancement. She would leave on her own terms, with her reputation intact and her sense of self restored. Her farewell address to the press corps would be remembered as one of the most honest and moving speeches ever delivered from the White House podium. In it, she would talk about the importance of truth-telling in democracy, the courage required to admit uncertainty, and the difference between strength and stubbornness. She would thank the reporters who had challenged her, acknowledging that their tough questions had made her better at her job and truer to herself. 6 months after that 2 a.m. phone call, Karoline would start working for a nonprofit organization focused on civic education and media literacy, teaching young people that public service isn't about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions with an honest heart and an open mind. She would travel to schools and universities across the country, sharing her story and encouraging the next generation of public servants to hold on to their idealism while developing the practical skills necessary to create real change. And every night before she went to sleep, she would remember that phone call and her mother's voice in the darkness, reminding her that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about who you choose to become when you get back up, and whether you have the courage to be yourself even when the world is trying to turn you into someone else. The little girl, who had once stood on a coffee table, arguing passionately for what she believed was right, had grown up to become exactly who she was always meant to be. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but authentic, compassionate, and unafraid to tell the truth even when it was complicated, even when it was hard, even when it cost her everything she thought she wanted.